14 people in that conference room were staring at me like I just walked in wearing a clown suit. My boss's son was standing at the head of the table, arms crossed, chin up, waiting for me to fold. And my direct supervisor, the man who'd hired me, who'd told me 3 years ago I was the best hire he'd ever made, was sitting 2 seats to my left, not looking at me at all. I'd seen that look before. Not on him specifically, but I knew what it meant. It meant, just do it, and we'll talk later. I didn't do it, but I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Trevor. I spent 6 years in the Army, 2 tours, 1 in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan, and when I came home I went back to school on the GI Bill, got my engineering degree, and spent the next 15 years building a career in industrial quality assurance. Not glamorous work, not the kind of thing you tell people at parties and watch their eyes light up, but it matters. When the components in a piece of heavy machinery are rated for a certain load tolerance, that number isn't a suggestion. It's the difference between a worker going home at the end of a shift and a worker going home in a box. I joined Hartfield Industrial Solutions 11 years ago. Hartfield had a solid reputation, mid-size manufacturer out of Columbus, Ohio, primarily supplying components to federal infrastructure projects and, for the last 4 years, holding a contract with the Army Corps of Engineers worth just over $180 million over 3 years. Not DoD weapon systems, but critical load-bearing components for bridges, flood control infrastructure, drainage systems on military installations. The kind of thing nobody thinks about until it fails. I was the senior quality assurance engineer. I'd worked my way up from an entry-level inspector role, earned every certification on my own time and dime, and by the time this story starts, I was the one sign-off that stood between our products and the federal government's acceptance stamp. My direct supervisor was a man named Gordon, solid guy, former Navy, like me, but different branch, and we got along well because of it. Gordon ran our operations division and was the one who'd fought to get me promoted when the previous QA director retired. I trusted Gordon. That trust would be tested. The problem started when the owner of Hartfield, a man in his early 70s who'd built the company from a 2-bay shop in 1987, brought his son on as executive VP of operations. His son's name was Cody. Cody was 31 years old. He had an MBA from a mid-tier school in Florida, a LinkedIn profile that listed him as a strategic growth consultant for the 4 years between graduation and his father walking him into our building, and a kind of confidence that only comes from never having been wrong enough times to learn humility. He didn't know what a load tolerance was. He didn't know the difference between a tensile strength specification and a yield strength specification. When I used the phrase material traceability documentation in our first meeting, he nodded slowly in the way people nod when they've already stopped listening. None of that would have been a problem if Cody had done what smart people do when they take jobs they're underqualified for. Listen, learn, and lean on the people around them. I've seen it work. I've watched people come in green and become genuinely good at what they do. Cody did the opposite. Within 3 months of joining, he had reorganized the procurement chain without consulting QA, introduced 2 new suppliers I'd never vetted, and begun pushing a cost optimization initiative that essentially asked every department to find 10% in savings within 2 quarters. On paper, 10% sounds reasonable. In practice, in quality assurance for federally contracted components, it's a flashing red light. I flagged it to Gordon in writing. I was specific. I said, the only way to find 10% in our department without compromising compliance is to reduce headcount or defer equipment calibration schedules, both of which create federal audit exposure. Gordon said he'd talked to Cody. A week later, Gordon came back and told me Cody appreciated the feedback and was looking at alternative approaches. I should have pushed harder then. I didn't. That's one thing I've had to sit with since. The alternative approach Cody landed on was a supplier substitution. Our Army Corps contract specified certain steel alloys for the load-bearing brackets we manufactured. The specs came directly from the Course Engineering Division and referenced ASTM standards, American Society for Testing and Materials, the organization that sets the technical benchmarks for materials used in construction and manufacturing across the country. These weren't suggestions from a procurement office. They were engineering requirements tied to the structural load calculations on actual military installations. Cody found a supplier in Georgia offering a similar steel alloy at about 22% less per unit. Similar, not identical. The yield strength was rated slightly lower, not dramatically, but enough to matter at the tolerances our components were designed for, and enough to fail compliance under the contract's ASTM specifications. I found out about it the way I found out about most things in those months, not from Cody and not from Gordon, but from one of my junior inspectors named Brendan, who came to my office one afternoon with a receiving document and a confused expression. "Trevor," he said, and held the document out. "This material cert doesn't match our approved supplier list." It didn't. The steel on our receiving dock had come from the Georgia supplier. The purchase order had been signed off by Cody's newly installed procurement coordinator. No one in QA had been consulted. I pulled the material cert, pulled the contract specs, and spent about 4 hours that evening verifying what I already suspected. The substitution didn't meet our contractual ASTM requirements. Not by a massive margin, but the margin didn't matter. The specification was the specification. I wrote a formal non-conformance report and submitted it to Gordon the next morning with a clear recommendation: quarantine the material, notify our Army Corps contracting officer, initiate a corrective action process. Gordon's response came back in 2 hours. He asked me to come to his office. I sat down across from him and he had the look on his face that I'd later see him wear in the conference room, that not quite meeting my eyes expression. He told me that Cody had reviewed the situation and believes the material difference was within an acceptable range for practical purposes. He used the phrase practical purposes. He told me the nonconformance report created a paper trail that could complicate our relationship with the Corps contracting office and potentially affect renewal conversations that were already underway. I told Gordon that I understood the business pressure, but that submitting components fabricated from non-compliant materials under a federal contract wasn't a gray area. It was fraud against the federal government, and depending on what the components were ultimately used for, it was potentially a safety issue for the personnel at those installations. Gordon told me he needed me to trust the leadership team's judgment on this one. I left his office and went back to my desk and sat there for about 20 minutes just thinking. I want to be honest here about what was going through my head, because this is the part people don't talk about. It's easy, looking back, to say, of course I did the right thing. What choice was there? But in the moment, there was a real calculation happening. I had a mortgage in Westerville. I had a daughter starting her junior year at Ohio State in the fall. I was 52 years old, and while my resume was solid, I was not naive about what the job market looks like for a 52-year-old in a specialized field when the word gets around that you created problems at your last employer. I sat with that for 20 minutes, maybe a little longer. Then I called my brother-in-law, who's an attorney. Not a contracts attorney, just a general practice guy in Dayton, but smart and someone I trusted. I told him what was happening in broad strokes. He listened without interrupting and then asked me 2 questions. Had I documented my objections in writing? And did I have any reason to believe I was being asked to personally certify the non-compliant materials? The answer to both was yes. My non-conformance report was in the system, and at some point in the fabrication process, the components would need my sign-off as QA. My brother-in-law said very simply, "Then you don't have a choice, Trevor. You sign off on those components. You own it with them." That was the thing that settled it for me. Not heroics. Not some grand sense of justice. I just wasn't going to own it. I started documenting everything. Over the next 6 weeks, I kept a personal log, date-stamped notes on my home laptop, separate from anything on the company system. Every conversation I had with Gordon about the materials, I followed up with an email summary, 4-hour records, which is a normal enough practice that it didn't raise flags. When Cody called me into a meeting to discuss QA process efficiencies, I took my own notes and emailed them to myself from my personal account before I left the building. The substituted material had already been used in a production run of brackets. Not all of them, enough to fulfill the first delivery on the current contract increment, about 300 units. They were sitting in our finished goods warehouse waiting for shipping release. I did not sign the release. This is where things escalated. Cody came to my office in person. It was a Tuesday morning, early, and I hadn't even finished my coffee. He sat down across from me without being invited and told me that the shipping hold was creating a downstream problem with our delivery schedule, and that the Corps contracting office had already been in contact asking about the delay. I told him the hold was in place because the units contained non-compliant material and I wasn't authorized to release them under our federal contract. He told me I was being inflexible. I told him inflexible was a funny word for following federal procurement law. He didn't like that. He stood up and told me that his father had built this company, and that his father trusted him to run it efficiently, and that people who couldn't be team players were a problem that companies found ways to solve. I looked at him and I said, "Cody, I want to be very direct with you. If those units ship, They ship with your signature on the release, not mine. I want that understood." He left without saying anything else. That night, he called his father. I know this because his father, the owner, the man I'd respected for 11 years, called Gordon the next morning. And Gordon called me. The conversation was short. Gordon told me that Elliot, the owner, had been briefed on the situation and wanted me to understand that the company had significant confidence in the technical assessment made by the procurement team. He also told me, in the careful language of someone who knows the conversation might be remembered, that my continued resistance to reasonable business decisions was being noted. I thanked him for letting me know and got off the phone. I was scared. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't. I was genuinely scared that I was about to lose my job, that nobody above me in the chain was going to back me up, and that the components were going to ship with or without my release because someone else would be found to sign them off. I called the Army Corps of Engineers contracting office myself. I want to be clear about what I did and didn't do. I didn't file a formal complaint. I didn't contact the Inspector General. What I did was reach out to our contracting officer, a woman named Ms. Caldwell, whom I'd worked with directly for 3 years and who I had a professional relationship with, and tell her that we had a material compliance question I needed her guidance on. I described the situation in factual terms. I did not name Cody specifically. I told her we had received a material substitution and I was unclear whether our process for documenting an exception request was compliant with the contract terms. Ms. Caldwell was very good at her job. She asked 2 clarifying questions, thanked me for the call, and told me she'd be in touch. She was in touch within 48 hours. She notified Hartfield's executive team that the Army Corps intended to conduct an unscheduled compliance audit of our current production run within the next 30 days. The company found out I had made that call within about a week. I don't know exactly how. Probably the timing made it obvious. Gordon called me into his office and he was different this time. Not the uncomfortable, not meeting my eyes version. He was cold. He told me that what I had done was a significant breach of the company's protocol for engaging with federal clients, and that by contacting the Corps directly, I had potentially damaged a business relationship worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I told him I documented my objections internally over 6 weeks and received no corrective action. I told him I had a professional obligation as a certified quality engineer that existed independent of my employment. He told me to think carefully about where I was positioning myself within the organization. The audit was scheduled for November. This was mid-September. For the next 6 weeks, the company was in what I can only describe as controlled panic. Cody was running around trying to construct a paper trail that suggested the material substitution had gone through an approval process. It absolutely had not gone through. There were meetings I wasn't invited to. There were emails I was CC'd on that were clearly being written for the audit record rather than for any practical purpose. And then, about a week before the audit, Cody made the mistake that ended him. He came to find me in the plant floor, near the end of the day when most people had gone home. He had his phone in his hand, and he looked like he hadn't slept well in about 2 weeks, which he probably hadn't. He asked if we could talk privately. We walked to a corner of the floor near the raw materials storage, away from anyone, and Cody, in a voice that was trying to sound calm and reasonable and instead sounded like someone who was genuinely frightened, asked me if there was any way I could characterize the material substitution as having gone through a verbal pre-approval process. I want to make sure I'm being precise here. He was asking me to say, to the federal auditors, that I had verbally approved a substitution process that I had never approved and had formally objected to in writing. I asked him to say that again so I was sure I understood him. He did. I nodded slowly. I said I would think about it, and I walked back to my office. My phone had been recording since I walked onto that plant floor. I want to explain that. It wasn't premeditated in the sense that I planned to record him that specific day. But after the conversation with Gordon about positioning myself, I had started carrying my phone in record mode during any interaction that felt like it might go somewhere I'd need to remember accurately. I'd looked up Ohio's recording law. Ohio is a one-party consent state, meaning I had the legal right to record any conversation I was a part of without notifying the other person. The recording was legal. What Cody had just put on it was not. The audit happened on a Thursday. The Corps sent 3 people, Ms. Caldwell and 2 technical assessors. I'd worked with federal auditors before, and they were thorough. They reviewed our material traceability documentation, our inspection records, our certifications, and the non-conformance log, which included my original report from 6 weeks earlier. There was a moment, about 2 hours into the audit, when Ms. Caldwell and one of the assessors were reviewing the purchase orders for the substituted material. and there was a silence in the room that had a particular quality to it. The kind of silence that means something has been found. They concluded the audit without announcing findings on site, which is standard. They would report back within 2 weeks. 2 days later, Gordon called a company-wide meeting. Everyone in operations, QA, and senior staff. About 20 people in the main conference room. The owner was there. Cody was there. I found out later that the purpose of the meeting, as framed to Gordon by Cody, was to address the cultural misalignment in the QA department that had led to an unauthorized contact with the federal client. What happened instead was that Cody stood up and, in front of his father and 20 of our colleagues, told everyone that I had created a hostile working relationship with the procurement team by refusing to collaborate on reasonable process improvements, and that my unilateral decision to contact the Corps had put the entire company's federal contracting eligibility at risk. He said he needed me to stand up in front of everyone and acknowledge that I had acted outside of proper protocol, and that going forward I would direct any compliance concerns through the appropriate internal chain of command. He said it with his father right there. He said it like that was a thing that was going to happen. I looked around the room. Gordon was looking at the table. 2 of my QA colleagues were looking at me with expressions I couldn't quite read, somewhere between sympathy and fear. The owner was watching Cody with a look on his face that I now think was a man who had already begun to understand that something was wrong but hadn't yet admitted it to himself. I said, before I respond to that, I'd like to play something for the room. I had my phone on the table in front of me. I connected it to the conference room display system. We used it for presentations regularly. There was a standard cable right there. I opened the audio file. Cody's voice came out of the room's speakers. Is there any way you could characterize the material substitution as having gone through a verbal pre-approval process? And then my voice, flat and clear, say that again, so I'm sure I understand you. And then Cody again, saying it again. The room was absolutely silent. I paused the recording and looked at Cody's father. I said, I've been a QA engineer for 15 years. I spent 6 years in the Army before that. I have never in my life falsified a federal inspection record, and I am not going to start because it would be convenient for this company's cost optimization initiative. I documented my objections to this material substitution in writing 6 weeks before the audit. I contacted the Corps because I had a professional obligation to do so, and because my internal objections had been ignored. I will accept any consequences for how I handled this, but I'm not going to stand up and apologize for doing my job. Cody started to say something. His father put a hand on the table and said, quietly, Cody, stop. That was the last time I ever heard Elliot speak in a meeting with any kind of authority, because what came after moved quickly. The Army Corps audit findings came back 11 days later. The non-compliant units had been flagged. Hartfield was required to quarantine and replace them at the company's cost, submit a corrective action plan within 30 days, and undergo a 6-month enhanced monitoring period for all deliveries under the contract. The DOJ's procurement fraud unit received a referral. I learned later, through channels I won't specify, that the referral had included documentation of Cody's request to me, the recorded conversation. Cody resigned the week after the audit findings. He and his attorney negotiated with DOJ for several months. I don't know the final terms of whatever agreement was reached. That was handled above my visibility. Gordon retired early. That one surprised me more than I expected. He'd been there longer than I had, and I think the situation had put him in a place professionally and personally that he didn't know how to come back from. He sent me an email the week he announced it. It said, "You were right. I knew you were right. I'm sorry I didn't back you up when it mattered." That email is still in my inbox. The owner, Cody's father, retained an outside firm to conduct an internal review and brought in a new executive VP from outside the family. He and I have never spoken directly about what happened. We pass each other in the hallway, and he nods. I nod back. I think that's probably how it'll stay. I'm still at Hartfield. I didn't expect to be. After everything, I'd started quietly updating my resume, having quiet conversations with a few contacts at other companies. But the new EVP reached out to me personally before he'd been in the building 2 weeks, sat down across from me in the same conference room where all of this had happened, and told me he'd read the documentation, he understood what I'd done and why, and he wanted me to stay and be part of rebuilding the compliance culture. He used the phrase, compliance culture. And I almost laughed, because that's exactly the kind of phrase that sounds hollow when a company is in trouble and means something when a company is serious about fixing it. I think he's serious. The jury is still out, but I think he's serious. My daughter asked me once, a few months after all of this settled, whether I'd been scared. She knew the broad outline. She'd seen me stressed, seen me on the phone with my brother-in-law at odd hours, sensed that something significant was happening even when I didn't share the details. I told her yes. I was scared the whole time. She asked if I'd do it differently. I thought about that for a minute. About the mortgage and her tuition, and the 20 minutes I sat at my desk after Gordon's speech about trusting the leadership team's judgment. I said the only thing I'd do differently is push harder 6 weeks earlier. When the substitution first came through receiving, I waited too long hoping someone above me would handle it. I should have known then what I eventually figured out, that when the people above you are asking you to be a team player about something that has a legal threshold, there is no team. There's just you and the record you're going to have to live with. She nodded. She's 21 and studying civil engineering. I hope she never has to make the choice I had to make. I also hope if she does, she makes it faster than I did. The 300 non-compliant brackets were scrapped. The Army Corps accepted the replacement units, fabricated to spec, every certification in order, documented to the letter. And the contract renewal was approved 6 months later, with the enhanced monitoring still in place. When that renewal came through, I was sitting at my desk and Brendan, the junior inspector who'd walked into my office with that receiving document and a confused expression, knocked on my open door and said, "Hey, saw the renewal came through." I said, "Yeah." He stood there for a second. Then he said, "Good." I said, "Yeah." That was enough. People ask me sometimes what the hardest part was. They expect me to say it was the meeting, the moment I connected my phone to that projector with Cody standing right there, his father 3 seats away. But that part was actually the easiest. By then, the decision had already been made. The hard part was the 20 minutes I sat at my desk after Gordon told me to trust the leadership team's judgment and just be a team player. That's where it actually happened. Not in the conference room, in that chair, alone, doing the math on my mortgage and my daughter's tuition and what the job market looks like for a 52-year-old who got a reputation for making trouble. That's the moment every person in a situation like mine eventually faces, and most people don't talk about it honestly because the honest version doesn't make you sound like a hero. It makes you sound like someone who was scared and had to choose anyway. I've thought a lot about why Cody ended up where he did. Not with anger. I don't carry anger about it anymore, but just as a matter of cause and effect. He was given authority he hadn't earned, insulated from consequences his entire life, and surrounded by people like Gordon who cared enough about their own position to tell him what he wanted to hear instead of what he needed to know. That's not an excuse. It's an explanation. The corner he backed himself into, asking me to lie to federal auditors, saying it out loud on a recording. That corner had been built over years by every person who ever smoothed something over for him instead of letting him face it. By the time he stood on that plant floor and whispered that question to me, he genuinely seemed to believe I might say yes. That tells you everything about the world he'd been living in. What I know now, that I didn't fully understand then, is that your professional record is the only thing in a career that actually belongs to you. The job can go, the title can go, the salary can go. But the record of what you signed your name to, what you approved, what you let pass, that follows you in a way nothing else does. I wasn't thinking about legacy when I refused to release those brackets. I was thinking about the specific practical reality that if those units shipped and something failed, my certification was on the paperwork. My name. Not Cody's. Not Gordon's. Mine. Brendan knocked on my door when the contract renewal came through and said good and walked away. That was it. No ceremony. No speech. Just a 26-year-old kid who'd handed me a receipting document 8 months earlier because something didn't look right to him and who'd watched what happened after and who said good like he'd been waiting to say it for a while. I think about that more than I think about the conference room. Because Brendan is going to be in his own version of the situation someday. Everybody who works long enough eventually is. And what I actually hope, is that he remembers it didn't require anything spectacular. It required documentation, patience, and the willingness to accept a bad outcome rather than put your name on something wrong. That's it. That's the whole thing. The rest was just consequences, finding the people who'd earned them.